Creativity has been a fundamental cognitive process involved in problem solving and communication. But what is it that makes us pick up a tool like a pencil and mark a piece of paper with a drawing? Are we just marking our existence in a time and place? There are a few ways to look at creativity. We can look at it in a reductionist way, where very few people and very few activities would be considered creative. In this view, only physical works like a painting or sculpture are creative, or a few intangible works like a song, and only eminent geniuses would be considered creative, like Da Vinci or Van Gogh, Einstein or Stephen Hawking. Or we can look at creativity in an expansive way, where almost everything anyone does could be considered creative. Whenever we speak, think, or act, we're being creative. To explore creativity, I came up with 8 questions that I asked a wide range of people, from creativity researchers and psychologists to creatives from all walks of life. Visual artists, musicians, cooks, comedians, and filmmakers. What is creativity?
So I think a mystic definition of creativity would be the fullest flowering of the seeds of our divine essence as human beings. That would be the definition that I would give you in the mystical tradition, that there is this seed of goodness and that its natural expression would be in creativity. I think of Irenaeus of Lyon, who said, that the glory of God is a human being that is fully alive. And that sense of being fully alive and fully rooted in our heart, the outgrowth of that is a fountain of creativity.
Excellent. That's I like that, because you're the first person I've talked to in the like Christian tradition. Like I said, I kind of wanted you to look through it at that lens, and you're the first person to give that kind of a response. So I appreciate that. Creativity and inspiration, are they different or similar to your mind?
I think that inspiration is the seed and creativity is the fruit or the flower. And to use one of my favorite mystics, Hildegard of Bingen, she was always turning our attention to where do we grow green and juicy. And this word that she uses of viriditas, that is the result of being connected in our depths to the source of inspiration. And then the fruiting and the flowering and the fecundity of that being rooted in that source of inspiration comes out in creative actions.
Excellent. Also, in terms of alchemy, one of the stages is like the peacock's feather, the cauda pavonis, but Jung called that viriditas.
And he was familiar with Hildegard of Bingen. He was inspired by her works, and we find reference to her artwork in particular. I think it's fascinating to look at the Red Book compared to Hildegard's Illuminations and how they're different expressions of contacting that same source of inspiration that speaks to each of us in archetypal ways, yes, but also has the personal expression, and that those two are marvelous mirrors of one another.
Excellent. The next question, I think I put a couple Picasso and Van Gogh quotes. I was supposed to put it below it, but I put it above it. Anyway, do the rhythms and cycles of artistic expression have anything to do with the cycles of the natural world?
Oh, yes, I think so. Absolutely. I think, we have, to look at the natural world, we have the seed that falls into the soil, and then there's that period of what looks like dormancy. It looks like nothing's happening on the outside. Everything is underground. We might look at that as happening at the subconscious level, but things that, for example, are incubating in dreams, that we certainly see that with both Hildegard and Carl Jung and across the mystic tradition. And so something can first appear to us as a dream or in the shadows. And that's analogous to me to that under earth growth and germination point. And then we have this season where it's shooting up And then all of a sudden it's bearing fruit and is in full flower. And we can't predict that. We can only, in the words of one Hindu nun that I knew when I was a teenager in Santa Barbara, she said, you can only prepare for grace. I think Sister Joan Chittister says the same thing as a Benedictine nun. You can no more make grace happen than you can make the sun rise, but you can be awake so that when it appears, you can do something. So there's that whole interesting thing. If we look at the metaphor of the garden, there is the process of cultivating the soil, of watering, of fertilizing. Sometimes the greatest acts of creativity don't occur during good seasons, but alchemically, as you know, they happen with the nigredo and with the whole element that is, looks awful at first. It looks like, it's excrement. And yet from that, if you look at Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, for example, or Dante's Divine Comedy, like what happens in the years where nothing seems to be happening, but everything is falling apart and decomposing, how that's actually preparing the ground for the later flowering and fruiting. And so I think that there's definitely the seasonal elements of that, and being tuned to that so you don't give way to despair. You think like, nothing's happening, I'm all dry, there's nothing here. And then what can you do with that? How can you put in the compost, if you will? How can you heat up the alchemical vessel and find the right rhythm of life so that you'll have the ultimate abundant harvest? I think those are all rich metaphors for the creative process.
Absolutely. Do you want to respond to any of the three quotes? I had a first Picasso quote, maybe. Well, actually, that goes in line with what we just said. Do you want me to say them again? Did you?
Please remind me.
So Picasso said, and it kind of goes to what you just said. He said, quote, "Every act of creation is first of all an act of destruction." Does that ring? How does that hit you?
I think that's an exaggeration. I think that was probably true for Picasso's particular style. But I think, for example, as the counterexample, Johann Sebastian Bach, who wasn't destroying things, but rather going to the essence of what existed and trying to discern what was at the heart of that and bring it to its fullest expression. So I think that that's more an aspect of Picasso's personality. But what I would alter, how I would say, is that very often in the seeds of destruction, just like in the seeds of a fire, there actually are seeds of renewal and new life. But not every act of creativity comes from destruction.
Right. Well, he was also known for like painting over and painting over and painting over. Like all his canvases have like 10 paintings on them.
Multiple layers, and he destroyed himself. He went through style after style after style where he was negating who he had been before and ripping up that canvas, so to speak. But that's not the only way. There are other ways of creativity that aren't quite so filled with rage and violence, let's put it that way.
Yeah. The second Picasso quote I'll actually tie to the next question, but one thing I want to point out, here's a quote from Van Gogh. "Always continue walking a lot and loving nature, for that's the real way to learn to understand art better and better. Painters understand nature and love it and teach us to see it." Now, that makes me think of two things that I kind of want to bring up in my documentary, which would be, because he talks about walking a lot and loving nature. Reminds me that the Japanese art of Shinrin-yoku is called forest bathing.
Yeah.
It's essentially like go take a hike and you'll feel better. But that's Eastern medicine, but it's also accepted in the West. Like you can find, there's a page on Kaiser Permanente that's all about Shinrin-yoku.
One of my close friends wrote a book on forest bathing, Amos Clifford. You might want to interview him. He's wonderful.
I may want to, yes. The other thing it reminds me of is he says, painters understand nature and love it and teach us to see it. So he's already talking about nature. And I want to bring up the fact that, and I discovered this during, my time at Pacifica, which I'm already over, by the way. So, and that is out of gematria, which is, the Greek and Hebrew way of where all the letters also are numbers. So names, like the number of the beast is a name, it's Nero, and so according to gematria, one of the names of God, Elohim, and the word for nature, Hateva, they both equal 86, the number 86. So if they're equal, they are equated, they are the same thing. And I do want to point that out. So it's almost like to me, Van Gogh is saying, painters understand God and help us to love it and see it. Well, what do you think of that? Am I on the right trail? What?
Oh, no, I think so. I think absolutely that the arts are one of the primary mystical connections that people have of the numinous. And in the Celtic tradition, the role of nature as revelation was essential. That in Celtic Christianity, it was said that there are two books that you should read from every day. One is the Bible and the other is creation, and that they are mirrors of one another. And we have in the great Greek tradition, going back to Pythagoras, the idea that the blueprint of the one, of what we might look at as primal source or God, yes, it's inherent in mathematics and geometry and astronomy, and that is mirrored in music. And the great composers of the centuries, I think of Bach in particular. At the moment I'm learning all of the Well-Tempered Clavier's preludes, and that encoded within every piece that he wrote, he saw that as an act of prayer, and that what he was looking at was the sense of how the ineffable is mirrored in the form of music, and how that is an expression of divine nature. And then I think too of composers. I'm doing a Debussy salon this coming week, and how he turned to try to express what is the essence of the sea and the wind and the breeze, and that relationship is so profound in the whole tradition of German Romanticism. Beethoven got his best ideas by walking in the forest. The Sixth Symphony, which is a symphony about nature, you can actually walk on a pilgrimage, and it's like, here's the brook that he was trying to put into sound. Here's the grove of trees where he was capturing the bird song. And he absolutely believed that nature was the highest revelation of the way that God spoke to him. And Brahms as well. Brahms would go into the mountains and go backpacking, and he said there were melodies everywhere, and that he was in danger of stepping on them. And so there's a long tradition, whether it's the poetic tradition, the artistic and visual depiction. I think of Monet as he ran to catch the light, getting up at 3 a.m. to see how the light was reflected on the haystacks, and over and over and over, his quest to capture the light as a divine revelation. And the artists, the mystics, the poets have known this, that God shines through these acts of creativity. That is the bridge, or the Greek would call it the nous, that realm in between the abstract, formless, the uncreated all, and the human material world. This imaginal bridge, well, that's where art and music and poetry make visible the invisible.
In that liminal space.
Yeah. Space, and becomes a language. To use Carl Jung's expression, it's like that's how, or I think of Rilke, the future must enter you as an image long before it occurs. It's like the ways that images or music can open the doorway to the numinous, to spiritual, or dare I even say religious revelation, has happened across the centuries, over and over and over. I'll reference, if you want, the painting behind me is a great example of this. The painter of this is a woman who's become a dear, beloved friend of mine, Sue Ellen Parkinson. And she came to a retreat I was leading on Mary Magdalene, knowing absolutely nothing about the Christian tradition. She had existed far outside of it. And we began that retreat with a slideshow of 333 images that I've collected around the world across the centuries of Mary Magdalene. And the art, before I said any words, any lectures, any Gospel of John or anything, the way that the art affects people opens a doorway for their own personal experience. Well, the end result of that is 10 years later, Sue Ellen has been painting icon after icon after icon after icon. She's developed her own incredible mystic connection with this figure of contemplation. It's guided her entire life. But the first sense of that mystical connection came through art and music. And then from art and music and story and history and prayer practices, she developed her own unique personal connection to the ineffable. But it spoke to her first in images, just like Carl Jung. All of his revelations came to him first in images, and then later he found the words and the vocabulary to translate the Red Book into scientific concepts and psychological language.
Nice. Some things, these are off script now. Some things you've been talking about. I feel like there's a couple things I want to draw down into one thing, but so I'm an artistic person. I don't like math, right? But I love music. And my colleague on campus here, the music teacher, if I ever say anything bad about math, he goes, remember, music is what math sounds like. There's one thing.
Pythagorean tradition, for sure.
Oh yeah. He read some book that got real into sound, and anyway. And do you know, everybody knows Lord of the Rings. Have you ever heard of the Silmarillion? Mm-hmm. So in the Silmarillion, the opening of Tolkien's book is called the Ainul and Dale, and it's all about how there's one God who creates everything through music. I don't know if you've read that.
No, I haven't, but one translation that I love of the Gospel of John is "In the beginning was the song."
I haven't heard that.
Yeah. That logos can also mean pattern, and the divine pattern. And the divine pattern is another way of describing music and musical architecture.
I really like that.
Well, that's an ancient idea, the celestial symphony that Dante talks about with the final apparition of the divine rose. And going back to the ancient Greek philosophers, this is what Pythagoras was all about, was tuning ourselves to the divine song. And Hildegard of Bingen and all of these other mystics who were trying to, one expression of spiritual practice, and I think of this even with the Desert Fathers and Mothers of Egypt, is tuning yourself through practice like a violin is tuned so that you can resonate with that vibration at the highest level. And so that's a very old idea, actually, to look at it. And in terms of your hating math, I was so with you for most of my life. I thought, this is such a waste, because mathematics was treated like this dead thing, that had no soul behind it. But the Greek lens of mathematics is just, it's the formula for music. Or, I'm looking behind you at all of those amazing arches, and that those are mathematical expressions of perfect intervals in music, the perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and perfect octave. So great architecture is frozen music, but that music is about relationships. And so to have a relationship where things are in harmony with each other, that's the point of geometry. And to develop the right relationships. And of course, unfortunately, in the Western modern world, we've gotten completely out of tune and out of balance and out of harmony. But if you go into one of those great Cistercian abbeys, if you sing the note that you sing is going to vibrate in the entire building in a way that brings out the greatest beauty of your voice and the greatest clarity and the greatest amplification. And you will feel the top of your head vibrating if you are singing Gregorian chant. Your whole body is going to be like a tuning fork. And the reason it is that way is because the entire building is constructed on these Pythagorean mathematical principles that tune the human being and the human body in space to be able to be like that tuning fork that resonates like crazy, that can open the doorway to mystical perception and numinous experience.
Awesome. Maybe because I don't want to get into this in my film, but maybe because it vibrates your pineal gland. Some of my cohort people wanted their dissertations on that. So.
Yeah, the whole body, your bones, everything, your inner ear, your bones, you're just like this. And it's amazing.
Before I ask another question, just a side thing from what you just said. I really like, by the way, the quote that architecture is frozen music. I think is what you said.
Yeah.
I like that.
That was used by, it's often used to describe Chartres Cathedral, and that architecture is frozen music and music is flowing architecture.
I like that a lot. Moving on, and maybe you've already covered this. What is the connection between creativity and the numinous? I think you've already covered it, but...
I think there's one more thing I'd like to say about that, though. I think that we find in the history of creativity over and over a double relationship. It can go either direction. You can have a numinous experience that results in you creating something amazing, or through the act of creativity, you can also touch into the numinous and have a transcendent experience. That sense that Susan Mihai writes about flow of entering a sort of mystic consciousness while you're in the middle of something that feels like artistic play. That in that sense, we, from a biological perspective, engaging in creativity, particularly in a musical or a visual form, can shift us from a left brain perception to a right brain perception. And we know from modern science that the right brain is really the repository of what we would call that mystical sense of union. And so it goes both directions. You have somebody like Dante who has a mystic experience and it becomes the seed of the Divine Comedy. But you also have people who feel like they have no connection to their spiritual lives, no religious background whatsoever, and you immerse them in singing in a choir for a Bach cantata or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or kirtan, or even maybe the Grateful Dead, I don't know. But through that act of participatory creativity, they suddenly touch into something that makes them feel part of a much larger whole that awakens a sense of wonder and awe, which I think is as good of a definition as any as the numinous.
Absolutely. The quote that I wanted to go with that question was, Picasso said, "God is really only another artist." What do you think of that?
How about I say God is the greatest artist of all? I think if one lens to look at Genesis, is that sense of God the creator sculpting out of the earth, creating the figure of Adam, creating the figure of Eve, and, that sense of creative abundance. I think that, when we touch into our creativity, we are touching into the essence of the divine imprint inside of ourselves. But, Picasso's so reductionist in saying he's only,
Oh, that's true. That is reduction.
He is an artist and, or God, not he.
Or she, or it.
Thou, the great thou, the ineffable. Yeah.
Right. So the next question, the third to last here, why do we create? And I can give you some context for that or not.
Okay, well, I can launch into it, and then if you don't like my answer, we can go into that. How's
Okay.
that?
So why do we create?
Well, I think there are as many reasons for creating as there are people in creations. There are certain patterns that we see over and over again. There is certainly the creation that's born out of the fires of Eros and love. Eros in the Greek sense with the capital E, of you feel this influx of energy and love and attraction, and you want to pour that out. I mean, how many books of poetry have that as their genesis? And then we create as a way of praise and celebration. You know, I think of Bach's 300 plus cantatas, every one of which he signed at the end, Solo Deo Gloria. You know, that was a prayer offering that he was giving as the creation of his cantatas. And then there is the Beethovenian path and the Dante path, which is the, creating because you're in agony, and it's the alchemical way to transmute your suffering and your sorrow and to find a pathway through, to take away the anguish of what you are living in the world, and that can be the only medicine. And then there is the creativity that's the bridge between people, that's the play, I think of improvisational theater, which is a form of creativity, and that sense of communication, another way to communicate. Felix Mendelssohn said, that music is a language far more precise than words. So there are things that you can't say because our language is so clumsy, but to sculpt or to paint or to write a piece of music is far more nuanced as a way of expressing something that's deeply important to you to communicate to others. So I think those would be the main. I think I would also just put in there as play, ludus, that the Homo sapien has an aspect of just the sheer fun of playing. You look at children who are finger painting or making with Play-Doh, and there's no outer purpose or reason for that. It's just the sheer joy of creating itself that you see expressed.
Absolutely. So giving the why do we create a little context, and you don't have to answer in this way, but I find that is one of the books, everybody kind of goes over creativity or creative people and psychopathology, or creative people nuts, and some people fall on that bent of like, no, creative people are insane. But a lot of creative people, I'd say most creative people, fall on, no, art is therapy for me. Like, I do that because I am suffering. Maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm not, or maybe it's just because life is suffering in a very Buddhist way. But because the quote I have from some poet, Antonin Artaud, is that no one has ever written, painted, sculpted, modeled, built, or invented except to literally get out of hell. Like mental hell. So I just think it's interesting. Most artists that I know and talk to come down on, no, art is therapy. I would be crazy if I didn't do this.
Well, and that is one part. So that part of my answer was like, yes, that is one pathway, that is one purpose, that is one expression of art. Absolutely. And I think that art therapy can be one of the most powerful modalities. And Jung himself said, if it hadn't been for putting his visions into the Red Book, he would have lost his sanity. So that's certainly true. But you look at somebody, again, to go back to Johann Sebastian Bach, and he's not doing it because he's crazy. He is doing it out of a sense of a joyous communion. And that's a different pathway, and sometimes a different purpose, So yes, there have been people. I think primarily the greatest example that I know about all of this is Robert Schumann, who did in fact ultimately attempt suicide, and who most people looking back, psychiatry has looked back on him and said he was most likely bipolar, as well as suffering most likely from syphilis. And through the act of composing, there was about, my guess is he probably got 12 more years of living than if he hadn't been a composer. It's like it kept the madness at bay for a much longer time, long enough to birth 8 children and to write 4 symphonies. It ultimately was not strong enough to protect him from that. I do think that there are certain kinds of art form and exploration. I think of modern filmmaking, for example, that are so dark, and the way that the roads that they go down, that perhaps they induce madness, I mean, what do you give your heart to? What do you give your mind to if you are writing books or making films that are about violence and insanity and depravity? The danger is always, as actors know well, what is the role that you're going to take on? Because you may become that. It may become you. So choose carefully. Choose carefully about what are you going to explore? Does it ultimately end in peace, hope, joy, something that is life-giving, or is it a pathway that is a pathway through or to hell?
Good answer. There's many things I could say, but I'm like, they're all off topic. Okay. Do you think creativity has anything to do with evolution?
That is such a great question.
And here's maybe what I mean by it, because I mean, in my mind, I can expand the meaning of creativity, even though, like I said, I don't like math, but math is very creative. Even, and I've like food preparation, building shelter, interacting with other people, sociability is creative. So it's almost, to my mind.
I think as you say that, about the film Apollo 13, as the astronauts are trying to figure out how to get home, and those were acts of creativity to figure out how in the world are we going to do this. And here's my answer. We are certainly in desperate need of creativity at this particular moment, given the ecological and social crises before us. I don't think as human beings that there is any way through what we've got before us without some major leaps, some evolutionary leaps in creativity and creative thinking and creative collaboration.
Absolutely. And this kind of goes to what you just said, honestly. How do you see creativity helping us, meaning humanity, in the future?
Yeah. So I think that there are 2 main ways. Many people feel we're entering what they call the long dark, and that particularly with the climate catastrophe and what we've been through this past year, I think that the people who perhaps maintain the best sense of hope and health during this recent year and a half of pandemic were people who engaged in acts of creativity, whether it was, writing practices, painting practices, planting a garden, developing new cooking skills, but finding some creative expression as a therapeutic way through difficulty and pain. So that's on the one side. And then on the other side is absolutely the sense that in our future, more and more, I think we're going to need to be relying on creative collaboration. And that so often, I think particularly within my own Christian tradition, one of the stories that's so near and dear to my heart was a wonderful man, a monk named Brother Roger Schutz, who was the founder of the ecumenical Taizé community in France, which was established during World War II. And he said, if we talk about things, in particular, if we talk about religion, so often our words will get in the way and we'll end up with arguments. But if we sit together and we sing, the doors of our hearts can open in trust and hope. And I think I see this in so many instances, coming together, whether it's painting a mural or planting a garden or engaging in some sort of creative ritual like a candlelit labyrinth walk, that opens a door of trust and communication that feels essential to me before going on to problem solving. It's like it opens up the possibility of a larger, I even want to use the word grace. It allows a door for grace to come in, either just that sense, of getting to know somebody in a different way. What is it like to have everybody write a poem and then read that? You get to know them in a different way. What is it to sing together before you enter into negotiations? I think you start to feel your shared humanity. What would it be like to experience some great act of creativity? In some small way, we try to weave this in. I think of the inaugural events. How effective would the inauguration have been without the music and without Amanda Gorman's poem? What people really remember is not the speeches of the politicians. What really draws them together with a sense of hope and wonder and possibility and shared humanity is participating in at least the witnessing, if not coming together to co-create, at least the witnessing of these acts of creativity that really get us down to the essence of what's truly important and what we share in common beyond all of our surface differences. And I think doing that again and again and again is going to be more and more important in the world.
Very, very excellent.
Yeah. Well, best of luck, Andy. Thanks for inviting me. It's fun.
Thank you so much for doing this, and I will email you those in the next couple days here.
Alrighty. Very good. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Telepathy is real, and I can feel you in my bones. Your thoughts are in the air, and they're landing in my mouth, converging from all directions. The energy is at home. Words from a long lost conversation are fleeting and reborn. Telepathy is real, and electric lines of light are traversing vast dimensions and appearing in my sight. In books, TV, and movies, the messages come through. Strange, vast potentials are planted in your room. From under the stairs, it's all coming to you. Staring into space or a stranger's face, you can read the proof. Telepathy is real, and I'm hearing you from the vast belly of blackness. Your reality comes through.
The painting behind you, is that your painting?
It's a painting by someone who took some of my seminars and painted it inspired by a pilgrimage we did to France.
Hmm. Would they be okay if that image is in the background?
Absolutely.
Okay. Um,
And I could actually use that as a touchstone for some of what we're going to talk about creativity and the numinous.
oh,
Um,
great.
because one of the things that I most deeply believe is that the seeds of creativity, it's almost like a mushroom matrix where the intertwining of that and having the touchstone with story or pilgrimage or music can become the opening to our own creativity. And Sue Ellen is one of the best examples of that I know.
Excellent.